For those of you who don't know me, I am Brad Lennon. I usually am sitting over here when we're in the church with Lito and Colleen and Robert, but I've been called out from the corners of the church to preach to you today because Allison is looking for a bit of a break over the summer. Christine is just coming on board. Robert and Lito are soon to be leaving us. So I'm sort of a last resort. As I prepared the sermon for this morning, I found myself rediscovering some once familiar routines because I used to preach regularly every Sunday, and I haven't done that for some time. I found myself looking again at lessons assigned for the morning, and then I would try to find something that had puzzled me, something for which I would want to seek a resolution. And there are many points in today's readings that could have provided me with such a source for my curiosity and exploration. There's that first lesson, the clearly subservient role for women within the culture of the Near East in Abraham's time. I could remark how Abraham sent his servant off to select and pay the price to secure a wife for his son Isaac. But how would I reconcile with what I know today about how women wish to be treated? Then, in sharp contrast to that first lesson, there's the wonderful depiction we have of the garden there in the Song of Solomon. And I could tie in that theme of the garden, our holiday garden we've been working on out here at the church here. However, what intrigued me most of all the choices I could have made this morning was from our gospel lesson. There I could have talked about that familiar passage about Jesus telling that we could put off our heavy burdens and exchange that for the yoke, the lighter yoke that he gives us. But what really drew my attention was the contradictory pictures of children that we have in this reading. At the start of the lecture, the listeners to Jesus received from him a negative example of their generation behaving like kids. They are like children taunting each other. But then, only a few sentences later, Jesus is commending children for their receptiveness to the revelation that he's bringing from the Father. The gifts that Jesus brings, those children will readily accept. Yet those same things that are made available to them remain hidden from those who are regarded most by society as the wise and the intelligent. Now, preachers can try to find from all of these lessons a unifying theme that will bring them together. Or they can focus on just one item and try to make things a bit simpler for themselves. But that contradictory portrayal of the children reminded me of how the gospel writers assembled their narrative of Jesus' ministry. That's how we have that passage before us, the one we have in today's gospel that we've just heard. And so I decided I would start from there. I can imagine how the first followers of Jesus would have shared their stories of him following his ascension back to the Father. Around that circle of friends, one person's story would recall to another a memory that would bring forth a different story from a second person. They would then tell others who had not known Jesus what they'd seen. This newest set of Christians would then tell stories of him that they had heard from the first companions of Jesus, events at which they had not been present as witnesses. And those stories would continue to be shared orally from one person to the next. Now, many of those first century Christians were not literate. So, the spreading of testimonies during those first years happened by word of mouth. But then there are those how would there be a way of authenticating these stories? That they would happen just as they were being told. How could they know that that was what had really happened when the first followers of Jesus began to die? There would soon no longer be anyone to provide eyewitness testimony to what they'd seen and heard. So that's among those first Christians, those persons who could read and write, began to record what they heard of the stories and sayings of Jesus. Again, the closest to which that happened was just as it had been with the first tellings of the stories. One key word in the account that they'd heard might occasion the memory of another incident or saying that someone had remembered from that oral history. So, as the writing began to happen, the listings of those stories and sentences of Jesus were out there. Those who wrote our four Gospels had choices to make. They could try to imagine what the original setting might have been, where Jesus had performed that deed or said these words, and those accounts that they still had. And sometimes it was easy to tell from the stories that they had retained through the years where they'd come from. For instance, they could deduce whether Jesus might have been speaking to his opponents, or to his disciples, or to crowds. But sometimes context was lost completely. Sometimes the evangelists had left just this list of the sayings, the stories of Jesus, just as they found them in the writings, as those original lists. And the passages or sentences remain only connected by roots of association that brought forth one memory after another from those first circles of storytellers. And I think that assembled list is how we have before us this morning that impression about children, that they're being mean and abusive to each other, and then we have immediately following a second conflicting idea in which they're particularly receptive and attentive to Jesus' teaching. It's that word, children, that's brought about these two incidents together from what was likely completely different episodes in Jesus' own life. So then how does a later interpreter like me reconcile these two conflicting depictions of children? Lizzie and I have not had children of our own in our household, so I haven't had examples from which I might learn something that might help me with this dilemma. Now, many of you will have had offspring about you, but I don't expect to find the answer to my questions about children's conduct from you either. From your questioning about what causes children to act as they do. Because I think that the negative and positive ideas that we have of those two sides to children's behavior arrives earlier than any of them or us have memories of why we first began to do the things that we do that are nasty or what leads us to be nice. However, this week I've been reading the Confessions of St. Augustine. And in his autobiography about how he became a convert to Christianity, Augustine has no hesitation in going back to his very earliest childhood to find examples of when he was naughty and not just an adorable baby. He writes, "So, even without remembering, I was already in existence and had life, and I was striving, while still speechless, to find a way of signaling my own meanings out to others." He could picture himself demanding in tears what would harm him. He could imagine himself throwing a tantrum when he was not obeyed by his own parents and by other adults. So I've been trying to imagine myself once again back in my early stages of life. Having just emerged from my mother's womb, I'd only see a blur of images. And then these would begin to resolve themselves into shapes after a few weeks. Later, I would try to reach for them and grasp them. I would not yet have had conceptions about anything back then, that early, back in my infancy. I wouldn't have had conceptions, but I'd have feelings. And one attitude I'd have would be a fear of all that newness that I was encountering with my senses. I'd want to retreat back from that frightening jumble of impressions into that warmth of security and oneness that I'd had with my mother. Yet there would also be within me an instinct to survive and perpetuate myself in my species. It would want me continually to try to assert myself and my own requirements with what I need. Those two drives remain within me and within all of us throughout our entire lives. On the one hand, we have our striving to try to fulfill our own self-longings. On the other hand, we have our desire to be back, reunited, and selfless with our mother. At the one side, the one extreme is eccentric, selfishness, egocentric. And at the other extreme is a complete disintegration of an individual's identity into what would be psychotic numbness to the world about us. Nevertheless, as my consciousness continued to develop, a process began to happen within me, for which there are many theories and perspectives, but no clear understandings. And that is, I began to acquire language through which I could express myself and organize those bewildering impressions that I was receiving from my senses. This is no simple development that happens to parents just repeatedly pointing to something and saying the word to label. Now that simple process might be how I came to associate my name with my own developing consciousness of myself. But think how confusing it would have been for me to have someone to point to that green book over there and say, book, and then say green. How would I distinguish between the object that we are naming and the color? How do we come to conceive of abstractions like beauty? How do we come to organize our words into grammatical sentences? I cannot hear children speaking their first words without being overcome by a sense of deepest of mysteries that I'm encountering. So it's that then that when Christians call out Jesus the Word, and we understand that God's creative power is happening by speaking the Word into the world into existence. God speaks, says, let it be done, and so it is done. My ability to understand language is so remarkable. To have words in which to frame my impressions of what I'm perceiving in the world around me, and to appreciate the patterns of clauses and effects that shape the world around me. This, in a way, parallels what God did originally in creating the universe. And this language formation of the world is critical for me. It's the way I find that balance between the self-centeredness of my will to survive and the madness of me trying to revert back to the womb of security that I once had with my mother. It's Jesus, the Word, spoken as my consciousness and my identity in the world have developed. It's Jesus, the Word, that has guided me on the way. Therefore, the gospel lesson this morning leaves me with three prominent impressions about children who are like I still am in many ways. First, they're self-assertive, to the point of sometimes being bullying and mocking. Second, they're also receptive and absorb input like sponges. And then there is Jesus, the Word, providing children, including you and me, with the language, the symbols, the stories, the rules for living. Jesus, the Word, is sometimes speaking in the instructions and commands of our parents. Jesus is sometimes speaking the examples of those that would take us our own lives. Jesus is sometimes speaking in our hearts in answer to our prayers. And here, you and I have gathered this morning to once again receive Jesus, the Word. And we will soon be sent out again into that bewildering and often frightening world to try to make some sense of it and to assert our own identities within it. But we will carry with us that Word of our Creator. And when we again start to feel lost out there, we can return to this place to replenish ourselves in that Word. Thanks be to God. Amen.